Shall we start?
Sure.
Oh. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Good morning. It's my immense pleasure to welcome you all to today's lecture on Love's Lexical Limitation, Translation Sanskrit Poetry. We are honored to have with us Miss Anusha Rao. Ms. Anusha Rao, a distinguished doctoral candidate in the study of religion at the University of Toronto. Anusha's research on the interesting of literature and philosophy, particularly in early modern Vedanta thinkers, is truly remarkable. Her work, including the co-authored anthology "How to Love in Sanskrit," highlights her deep engagement with Sanskrit poetry and its translation. We are happy to welcome to our immersion program series, Anusha. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you're audible.
Great. I'll just share my screen.
Just a minute.
Is my screen visible?
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. I'll get started right away then. My gratitude to Dr. Srinivasa Acharya as well as Dr. Vishnuvardhan and the other faculty at the Department of Philosophy, Manipal, for having me here today. So I'm Anusha Rao. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto, and I work, like was just said, on the intersection of literature and philosophy in early modern Vedanta in South India. I'm delighted to be here today. I must warn you all that it's almost the middle of the night in Toronto now, so please forgive me for any slowness or errors. My talk today is titled Love's Lexical Limitations, translating Sanskrit love poetry. So we'll discuss some challenges that I've faced while translating love poetry, what I think the reasons are, and one possible framework on how we can best translate one genre of love poetry. And I'll be drawing from my recently published book, How to Love in Sanskrit, that came out with HarperCollins India in February. So let's begin. If you're all able to see and hear me just fine, let me know at any time if you're not. Let's begin with a glimpse into one historical moment in the translation of Sanskrit erotic texts. So what you see up on my slide here is a screenshot of the first page of Richard Burton's translation of the Kama Sutra in 1883. And this was an early translation of any erotic text in Sanskrit into English for one of the first times. And if you can see there, it says translated from the Sanskrit by the Hindu Kama Shastra Society. Now you might be wondering what this society is and how you've never heard of it before. That's because Richard Burton made up the society. So it was a matter of such scandal to publish something like a translation of the Kama Sutra that he actually made up a society, and he didn't let his own name appear anywhere on the front page. So his translation is now known to be Orientalist in many places. His language is pretty Victorian and all of that. But what came about as a result of this translation of the Kama Sutra is that the Kama Sutra went viral, basically. So even today, if we were to speak of Sanskrit and the erotics, everyone immediately thinks of the Kama Sutra. But it turns out that the primary source of Sanskrit literature on love is a genre that's entirely different. And we'll look a little more deeply into that soon. But we have come a long way since Burton. And despite that, we still find plenty of issues to talk about regarding Sanskrit translation and love. So here is a translation as a second sample from the last century. So I'll just show you the translation first, and you can see if you can make any sense of it. It reads, O deity, be pleased to ordain for our beloved one an addiction to other women. For male persons who enjoy the love of one female person cannot discriminate between merits and demerits of women. So as you can see, this is extremely literalist, and it's not even very clear what the point of the verse is. So for comparison, here is the way our book translates the verse. Dear God, make him hang out with other women more. He does not seem to realize what a catch I am. So we feel like this captures the punch of what the verse might have been. This is a Prakrit verse from the Gaha Sattasai, a very, probably the most celebrated a work of poetry on love in Sanskrit, Prakrit, and all the other allied languages. So this kind of literalist translation was very much the norm up to pretty recently in the Indological world. So this is a very literalist translation. Granted, it's a very extreme example. Not all of them are like this. Nevertheless, most of them have Victorian language, and they stick very much to not taking any liberties at all with the text to aid the reader to make sense of the text better. And the language too, as I said, is really Victorian in many of these early translations of texts. But we're not at, so what I'm implying is not that all the translations that come out now are much easier. So here is a final sample before we really begin with the talk. And this is a very recent translation published by the Columbia University Press in as recently as 2017. So again, I'll just show you the poem first. The poem's title is here. Of course, the Sanskrit poem does not have the title with it. So this is something that the translator has given us to aid us in understanding. And it reads, once untied, my woman's hair tumbles down, damp, filling the air with perfume, only to be tied again before it clings to her loins, burnt by the white flow of passion. Now, this seems to make some kind of sense. But if the poem seems really modern to you, then I would say that is because it is. Because the idea in the Sanskrit poem, which I'll now put on the side, seems to be an entirely different one and depends on a series of wordplay. So in Sanskrit, this verse is actually depending on a series of puns, which is comparing a woman's hair to someone who wants moksha. So let's see a more plain, let's say, translation that I have just put up on the side. My beloved's hair, having given up attachment or oil, that is sneha in the Sanskrit, and having drunk in smoke, came to be freed or liberated. But after contact with her hips, became bound once again. How catastrophic is attachment to worldly things. So if we go line by line in the verse, basically it's talking about a woman's hair and the process of washing it and drying it. So what happens at the start? Women in India, we tend to oil our hair before we wash it. So first it was oily, but then it gave up oil. So in Sanskrit, sneha. So just like an aspirant who wants liberation gives up attachment, sneha, to worldly things, similarly, the hair too gave up attachment. That is, it gave up oil. And then, so the woman here took a bath. And then what happened? So you know how women in India dried their hair until very recently is in fragrant smoke. So there's a lot of love poetry on the kind of fragrance that the woman's hair emits. So since women dry their hair in smoke, here the poet, the speaker's beloved, is drying her hair, her wet hair, just freshly washed hair, in fragrant smoke. And so her hair has drunk in smoke. That is one level of the pun. The other level is that any aspirant to moksha undertakes various kinds of penance. And one of the popular kinds of penance involves sitting around fire. So then her hair has drunk in smoke as a part of performing various kinds of tapas or penance in order to get moksha. So then what happens? The hair comes to be freed. It becomes mukta. So on one level, again, it's because she's leaving her hair open right after it dries or in the process of its drying. And in the other level, the hair attains liberation, moksha. It becomes mukta. All right, but the story doesn't end there. So the poet's beloved, presumably has really long hair because it comes into contact with her hips because she has let it loose, remember? And soon as it comes into contact with her hips, she ties it up again, maybe into a braid or a bun or something, but she ties it up. So after contact with her hips, again, contact, sanga in Sanskrit, is a pun again. So it's literal contact, but it's also in terms of attachment or contact with worldly things. So then it becomes bound again a pun, depending on baddha in Sanskrit. So you can see, if you compare the rendition on the left to the one on the right, that they seem to convey very different meanings, to the point that the one on the left may not really be a translation of the idea on the right at all. Which brings me to the point that even contemporary translations come with a whole set of problems. So with this preliminary look, let's move on to exactly what we'll discuss in the talk then. So first, we'll talk about what makes translation from Sanskrit so difficult. I'll be focusing on love poetry, of course. So the first thing is the conventions of love poetry in Sanskrit itself, the basic conventions and tropes, and why they're difficult to translate. And then we can talk about other complications, which are the features of Sanskrit itself, or of literary or poetic Sanskrit as a language, which makes translation into English difficult because English works very differently as a literary language. And then we'll talk about what we can do and one potential way of rendering Sanskrit love poetry into the English, which will focus on the genre of the muktaka, which we'll go into. It's a freestanding verse. So in what way does structure of the muktaka in Sanskrit help us as translators working to convey the meaning of a verse in English? Then we'll look at, just for a short while, at what Sanskrit poetics tells us about the relative importance of elements in a poem. So obviously, when we're translating from one language to another, we cannot bring everything from the source into the target language. So what does the tradition itself tell us in Sanskrit literary theory about the relative importance of various parts of a poem? And finally, I'll conclude by looking at what a potential framework for a translation would look like. So to begin with, what makes translation from Sanskrit so difficult? One is how full of poetic conventions Sanskrit as a literary language is. The language itself was created for this kind of poetry. To start with, we have poetic fancy. So I should also point out that this is not merely a problem that someone living away from India would have in relating to Sanskrit love poetry, because we are as distant from Sanskrit poetic conventions as, say, an Englishman now is from Shakespeare's world, or even more distant than that. And Sanskrit is full of poetic fancies. So just to give you some examples, the literature is filled with birds and trees of various kinds, many of which are mythical. So we have the chakora bird, which refuses to drink anything except to drink in the rays of the moon. We have the chakravaka birds, which are said to mate for life, and so they meet during the mornings, but at night they're stranded on opposite ends of a river bank, calling out for each other very piteously. So these are very standard tropes in Sanskrit literature. As is the trope of various trees, like the Ashoka tree is said to blossom only when a beautiful maiden kicks it with her foot. And there are other trees that only blossom when a woman sings to it. So there are so many of these conventions that we are not aware of. And these conventions happen to be the building blocks upon which Sanskrit poetry is built. So no poet is going to sit and explain to you in the poem that this particular Ashoka tree is supposed to blossom when a beautiful woman kicks it with her foot or strikes it with her foot. But it's taken for granted. And then you can have various poems on the Ashoka tree, which assume you know this, when actually it's difficult to communicate to a reader without breaking the tone of the poem. Then we have another favorite device of the Sanskrit poet, the hyperbole. So Sanskrit poetry is hyperbolic to a degree that modern readers of just say contemporary English poetry would not be able to fathom. So the very start of Kalidasa's Meghaduta comes with a yaksha who, as you know, is separated from his beloved, who is somewhere else, all the way up in Alaka while he is in Ramagiri. And so the poem opens itself with a description of what the yaksha looks like. He has been parted from his lover for so long that it's made him so thin that his bracelet has slipped off of his wrist. So just imagine a poem where your bracelets routinely slip off your wrist because you've become that thin from missing someone. It's hyperbolic to an extent that modern readers would find difficult to imagine. And it's hyperbolic to the point that even so deaths are really casual, and people die from viraha. So from the pain of separation, people routinely die in muktakas and other forms of Sanskrit poetry. And even this does not always pose a problem. So if you look at the famous Kadambari, Bhanabhatta's prose work, then you will see that both the male leads are killed off right in the middle of the story. And if you're left wondering if it'll be a disappointment, it's all fine because they're resurrected again in another life. And then the love story ends happily. So in this way, even death does not get in the way of romance in Sanskrit, and it becomes a part of the story. And then we also have the characters within Sanskrit love poetry. So there are some standard tropes. One, there is a Nayaka and a Nayika, and the Nayaka might have many lovers. He might be very Anukula, that is, he might be very amenable to the heroine at that point, or he might have just had a dalliance with someone else, which is also the content of a lot of love poems. And then we have the Nayikas who also respond in different ways. Some of them might be naive, some of them are more experienced, some of them know all the wiles that they're supposed to come with, some others are very innocent, and so on. Then we also have the role of the messenger, which becomes very, very important. So women always send messengers, their friends, female friends as messengers to the hero to convey their message. And then we have the Abhisarika, who's one of the Nayikas, who's a very popular Nayika, who has a whole genre of poetry about her. And an Abhisarika is a woman who marches out, as you can see in the painting there, who marches out in the dead of the night to meet her lover for a secret rendezvous. And yeah, so she doesn't mind tripping over snakes and crossing various rivers, so long as she gets to meet her lover. And the Abhisarika is an important trope as well. So we have all these different characters and tropes. Finally, the emphasis of Sanskrit poetry is on longing. So no matter what other moods we see, the most powerful poetry is written about longing. And we must remember that most of this poetry, although it is a continuing tradition today, most of this poetry is written at a time that was very different, when there is no mode of communicating with someone who's traveling, and when men routinely travel away for months on business or some other work, and their wives are stranded at home without getting word of them. And so we have all these kinds of descriptions of how even sandal paste, which women apply on their bodies to soothe themselves, begins to burn from extreme heat when they're parted from their lovers and missing them, where people swoon simply at a light breeze when they're away from their lovers, or even at the scent of jasmine. So these are just some of the very few conventions that I named off the top of my head. There are so many more. And like I said, they're the building blocks on which more complicated ideas are built. So there must be at least like 150 verses, actually around 500 verses, simply on the moon and various ways of comparing it to a woman's face. So all of these tropes become building blocks, and without being very familiar with them, it's difficult to introduce a reader to something more complicated that comes off after knowing these. But this is not the only problem. We also have the nature of the Sanskrit language itself. So this is a translation from the book that I mentioned. If she were but a pond, her eyes two lilies, her face a lotus, her slender arms lotus stalks, her dancing eyebrows ripples, I would plunge at once into the cool waters of her loveliness and be rid of the searing pain that threatens to rip life from limb. So from the tropes that I just told you about, we can imagine that this occurs in the context of a separated lover, that the speaker is a male speaker who is longing for his lover and imagining her as a pond. And you can also see here the conventional trope of virahatapa, the heat of separation, burning up the lover who wants to cool himself by plunging into a pool. So this is the verse itself, a translation of the verse. But let's look at what it is in the Sanskrit and what some of the challenges of rendering it in this way are. So first, so I'll just read it out in the Sanskrit meter to give you a sense of what the meter sounds like. Netrendi varini mukham buruhini bhruvalli kallolini bahudvandva mrinalini yadivadhur vapi punassa bhavet. तल्लावण्यजलावगाहनजडैर् अङ्गैरनङ्गानलज्ज्वालाजालमुचस्त्यजेयमसमाः प्राणच्छिदो वेदनाः. So the effect of Sanskrit meter is really gorgeous, as you can see. This particular meter is called the Shardula Vikridita, or the play of the tiger. You might have come across it in your study of Sanskrit or other Indian languages. And it's supposed to mimic the hunt of the tiger. So you can really see a rhythm and cadence to the Sanskrit that it's impossible to bring into the English. Apart from that, we also have, if you notice, the prana chido vedanaha in the very last quarter of the verse. And that prana chido vedanaha is referring to pain that can rip apart your pranas or your very life. And the harsh sounding chido vedanaha really represents that kind of ripping sound. That also becomes very difficult to replicate in the English. The other feature of the verse itself here is the caesura or the yatisthana. So the Shardula Vikridita meter, the play of the tiger meter here, has 19 syllables in every quarter. And there is a natural break that occurs after 12 syllables before the last 7. So Bhruvalli Kallolini are the last 7 syllables. So the first break would occur after Mukhamburuhini, and similarly in each line. Now, if you notice in the last fourth line where the break occurs, it would occur right after Asama. So we would have Asama Pranachido Vedana with a break right there. So the break almost sounds like a sigh of a dejected traveler who is missing his lover. And this kind of effect too is absolutely impossible to bring into English. Apart from this, you can see the highlighted alliterations and consonances. So the Netrendi Varini, Mukham Buruhini, Bhruvalli Kallolini, all the l's and the n's and e's give such a pleasant effect. So if you consider something like a Narasimha Stotra, hymn to the god Narasimha in Sanskrit, you will never find a very soft sounding meter. You will always find harsh syllables repeating to mirror the kind of subject of the hymn itself. Whereas if you look at gentle love poetry, especially in the hands of someone like Jayadeva, then it can be used very effectively, Kalidasa as well, to give a very melodious or mellow kind of effect. So in fact, I still haven't found a single Narasimha Stotra which has a similar mellow effect. You simply won't find it because the subject is the ferocious form of Narasimha, and so the meter will always mirror that kind of subject. Then you can also notice here the Angair Ananganala. So that is a contrast, Anga, Ananga. And because of the flexible word order of Sanskrit, unlike English, that is possible to do as well, that you can present seemingly contrasting words you can place by the side to greater effect. So these are just some of the elements of meter and sound and word order, of course, that Sanskrit has naturally, which English poetry simply does not use today. Now here is a more literal kind of rendering of the verse, just to see some of the challenges. So if the girl were a reservoir with eyes blue lotuses, face lotus, eyebrow wine waves, arm lotus stalks, I would give up these bodiless fire flame multitudes spewing, life breath cutting, incomparable agonies with my limbs that are her loveliness water immersion cooled. So the feature of Sanskrit syntax that you see standing out right away here is the compounds. So if you look at all the hyphens there, just consider Anangana Lajvala Jala Muchaha, or as I've translated it here, bodiless fire flame multitude spewing. And this is a single word in the Sanskrit. So, but what is this bodiless thing? Well, here a cultural convention comes into play because Manmatha, as you very well know, was burnt to ashes by the god Shiva. And so he's called Ananga because he has no limbs, he has no body, but he still exists without a body. So he is Ananga. So Ananga, Anala, the fire of Manmatha, and the flames of that fire, but not just the flames, the multitude of flames of that fire. And those are spewing. So this kind of image, which is captured so succinctly in a compound in Sanskrit, can't be replicated either in a translation. And then we have the problem of metaphors. So what is this eyebrow wine waves? Wine and waves both going together doesn't make much sense, but eyebrow wine itself is a very common compound in Sanskrit, and that here is compared to wave. So metaphors are not plug-in across languages. It would lead to disastrous effects. So in so many places in Sanskrit, people give compliments that would not translate as compliments. So a woman's thighs are routinely compared to an elephant's trunk, for instance, which would not be a compliment at all. And the incongruity of these kinds of metaphors when translated into English gets highlighted all the more when you're dealing with the aesthetic sentiment of Shringara. When you have the Shringara rasa, it's very easy for it to turn into a parody. So translating that becomes all the more challenging. In fact, in one of the verses in the book, we dealt with a verse that said that paid a compliment to a man, saying, when in bed with his lover, he's as talented as an elephant. So imagine trying to say that in English the same way. If you try to plug in the same metaphor, it becomes a kind of parody of the sentiment of Shringara itself. So then these are just some of the challenges that face us when we're looking at translation. So what can we do? So one of the things that we try to do in the book is, since this translates muktakas particularly, we'll look at what muktakas are as a genre, and that itself offers some help to a translator because of the very nature of muktakas. So this is an instance of a muktaka, as are some of the ones we saw already. So here I have both the translation from the book as well as the Sanskrit side by side. How lucky that you remember every little detail, how he smiled, how he looked, even how he felt. As for me, I felt his hand slide across my waist. After that, try as I might, I can't remember a damned thing. So this poem is attributed to the Chalukyan queen, Vijjika or Vidya, and is found in multiple anthologies. It's a very popular verse in Subhashita anthologies. So what are some of the features of this verse? So as you can see, the meaning of the verse is it's a humble brag kind of verse. And we've titled it In the Women's Locker Room. So it's a bunch of female friends discussing their time spent with their lovers. And one woman presumably just spoke about how her lover smiled, how he looked, and all of that. And so this is a kind of rejoinder to that the speaker here is giving us, saying, you're so lucky to remember every single detail. Why I can't? I feel so bad I can't remember anything at all. So as you can see, the dhvani here, or the suggestion or implication, as we'll go on to see soon, is that it is in fact far superior to not remember, because that means your time with the lover was so much more memorable that you can't even remember it. I mean, it made you speechless and even thoughtless, presumably. So that's the dhvani here. And that becomes clear in the verse itself. Now, what makes this a muktaka is that it's a freestanding verse. Apart from some minimal context that you need in order to understand any Sanskrit poetry, you can just read the translation and you can figure out the rest of the context, and you don't need anything else. So it's not dependent on a particular character. You don't need to know who is speaking. You don't need to know anything outside of the text itself. So this muktaka is very, very common in Sanskrit. So you can find a verse from the Mahābhārata that might generally just be about the human condition. And then you'll also see it in the Ramayana. You'll also see it in the Shuka Saptati. Maybe you'll see it in the Panchatantra, and you might see it much later. Not always cited, sometimes cited back to the text, sometimes not cited. So it's a kind of free-floating verse that you can plug in anywhere to good effect. So for instance, Sri Harsha in the Naishadhiya Charita might describe the heroine Damayanti in a verse, but the verse does not mention the word Damayanti, and it can be used to describe any beautiful woman anywhere. So you would find it in many anthologies under descriptions of a beautiful woman's face, for instance. So that would be a muktaka. It's a freestanding verse. Now, one of the advantages of the muktaka, as you can see, is that since there is no character development, because it's just a single freestanding verse. So the characters there are anonymous and they stand in for everyone. And this makes it kind of universal. So the rasa has to come through in a muktaka without familiarity with the characters. So in case of a Mahakavya or Nataka, so you can find muktakas anywhere. You can find them in anthologies, you can find them in Natakas, you can find them in Mahakavyas, all kinds of other texts. And you can just put them in somewhere else or place them in an anthology, and they will still make sense. What this means is that the muktaka itself generally allows us to allows itself to be understood without too much context, which means that it's also easy for a translator to work on. So you don't need to work on building up a character in order to empathize with them, in order to make sense of this. And of course, one of the most famous set of muktakas in Sanskrit is the Amarushataka for love poetry. And each of those is like this. None of the characters is named, but they say that Amaru packs into a single verse what most people would need to write a long essay to do. So on the relative importance of elements in a poem, we'll see that in most Sanskrit poems, including love poems, there is a single key idea in the verse. This, of course, does not apply in an epic poem where you have to carry the story forward and multiple things might happen. But in muktakas particularly, it can only carry one key idea that shines through in the verse. Sometimes the key idea is a suggested one. So it's a dhvani, it's an implicature, it's an instance of implicature. But even in cases where it's not implied but stated, there is always one key idea in a muktaka and everything else becomes subordinated to it, which obviously helps a translator when trying to decide what to carry through to the translation. So this, going on to speak a little bit about Dhani, which is supposed to be the soul of poetry, kavyasya, atma, which shines through in a lot of muktakas as the key idea of the verse itself. So here is an instance. Her husband is very possessive. He does not let her go out at night to pick the mahua blossoms. Simple-minded as he is, he leaves the house at night to pick the blossoms himself. So you can get from here that the implication is that he's giving her an even better chance to meet her lovers because he's leaving the house to her, basically, and leaving her alone at night. And the only thing you need to get this verse is that the mahua blossom, which also you don't really need. But one of the things is that the mahua, or the madhuka flower, is something that's only supposed to blossom at night. And so she has a good excuse to need to pick it in the night. But this is an instance of dhvani because it's not saying exactly what is happening, but it makes the implication clear to everyone. And Sanskrit rhetorics holds this to be the most superior kind of poetry, as we'll go on to see. So now, what you see on the left is an image of a Chitra Bandha. So Sanskrit as a language allows for the kind of verbal feats that are impossible in any other language. So along with the already existent constraints of meter, we can see here in the figure of the snake, you can see various letters there. So the letters form a verse in which letters repeat in the exact same order as the pattern that you see here. And it all has to make sense. So poets can write under constraints that other languages can't really imagine. You can also have verses which are very simple and still simple to understand, but still fulfill these nearly impossible criteria. So for instance, there's a verse that says, Same sama samo ma sa same ma sa sama sama, yo yata yata ya yati ya yat ya yata yata ya. So this is only using two consonants and still it makes complete sense. And you don't even need to be an advanced Sanskrit scholar to understand it. It's a fairly simple verse. So these kinds of things are impossible to replicate in, say, English. You can't make a poem with just two sounds, or if you do, it can't say all that the Sanskrit one does. But what is surprising is that Sanskrit rhetorics and poeticians tell us that Dhvani Kavya is much superior to this kind of Kavya. So anything that you might do in terms of this verbal jugglery or this kind of bandha, or even in terms of alankara or the various figures of speech that you can add into a poem, are all supposed to be decidedly inferior to Dhvani Kavya, a Kavya that suggests that suggests the key idea instead of stating it. So only when everything else is subordinated to what is suggested in the poem can the poem truly be superior? So all other kinds of kavya are inferior, even from the standpoint of traditional Sanskrit aesthetics. So what this does tell us is that when prioritizing the various elements of a poem that need to be conveyed in the translation, even if the sound effects can't be replicated, it is fine because they are just adding to the meaning of the verse when the crux of the verse lies in that one key idea. So there is just one other important point that I want to make about ambiguity in Sanskrit poetry, because what we see in a lot of translations, like the poem about the hair that I showed you at the start of the presentation, what we see is that there tends to be a kind of vagueness or ambiguity in translation. So I think the rhetorical tradition in Sanskrit itself can help us make sense of where ambiguity is desirable, or at what level these scholars debate the meaning of the verse, and at what level it stays clear. So this is a verse, not in the book, but it's a very celebrated muktaka verse that is quoted multiple times in various anthologies and by various scholars of rhetoric in Sanskrit. So there is no trace left of your sandal paste on your breasts, not even a hint of color left on your lips. Coal is missing from the corners of your eyes, and you have goosebumps all over. You, my friend, are a liar with no idea of my troubles, for you went to the well to bathe instead of going to meet that wretch, my lover. So as you can imagine here, the context is that of a duti, a messenger. So the heroine who is speaking in this poem has sent her messenger to her lover to convey a message, probably that she's missing him and to meet her and so on. And as is a standard trope in Sanskrit poetry, the duti, the messenger herself, goes and has an affair with the man instead of simply conveying the message that her friend gave her. So now the Naika, or the heroine in this verse, happens to be a particularly mature woman. She's not naive and innocent, in which case she would have just broken down and cried, probably. But she's experienced, and what that means is that she's not going to tell her friend directly that she knows what she did, because it's vulgar too. But she's going to indicate to her, nevertheless, that she knows exactly what she's been up to. So what is interesting for us is the kind of discussion that this merits within Sanskrit texts on poetics. So we have figures like Appaya Dikshita, 16th century, important thinker both for Vedanta as well as for Sanskrit poetics, who quotes this verse at the very start of his Chitra Mimamsa. And he has a very long discussion on exactly what this means. Now, he's very clear that the Dhani, or the implicature within this verse, is that the messenger has had an affair with the hero. But then he goes on into detail. So he makes a whole argument about what exactly these details are doing. So the poem says, there is no trace left of your sandal paste on your breasts. So Appaya Dikshita says, if it were the case that she went to take a bath at the well, then surely there would be a little bit of sandal paste left, at least, because she would have been in a hurry. A well is a public place in those times, and when you have to bathe there, you don't have the luxury of taking all the time in the world. So the fact that there is no trace at all left of the sandal paste indicates that, in fact, the heroine is aware that she has not gone to the well to bathe, and instead she's gone to meet the heroine's own lover. And then similarly, there's not even a hint of color left on your lips. So if it was just about a bath, surely there would be a little color left. Similarly, about the goosebumps and so on. So he goes on to justify at each instance why it must be the case that the woman here has gone to meet the lover instead of going to the well. And then we have Jagannatha Pandita, who is very critical of Appaya Dikshita, writing a rejoinder to every single thing the Chitra Mimamsa says. And he goes on to say, well, this is absolutely not true. In fact, even if a woman were to go bathe at the well, exactly the same things would happen. There would be no sandal paste left at all, not a hint of color, and so on. So we can see the level at which these Sanskrit scholars on rhetoric are arguing with each other. So the argument is about a much deeper and a more micro level of Dhvani, which is to say, they're talking about whether it is possible that two equally likely explanations can exist, and then one has to make sense of it in exactly one way. Or if it is the case that only one likely explanation can exist for the Dhvani to occur and the other one is ruled out. So if the seeming meaning can still exist alongside the Dhvani, or if it has to collapse altogether for Dhvani to come into play. So what this tells us regarding ambiguity in Sanskrit is that even at this, even in a verse like this, where the meaning is not stated at all, there is no ambiguity at all about what the key idea of the verse is. All these writers on rhetoric and poetics completely agree on what the meaning of a verse is. What they disagree on is the much smaller details and theory as to how the implicature comes to function in the first place. There are, of course, some instances where people read dhvanis into the text that not all scholars of poetics would agree on. So there is a commentator who takes every verse of the Amaru Shataka as actually being a spiritual metaphor. And I'm sure a lot of scholars would disagree with such a characterization. But overall, you get the idea. It's Sanskrit poetry prides itself on being clear, and any vagueness in meaning would not be considered a kind of virtue of the poem, but rather one of its flaws. So this is the general idea of how muktakas work and what poetics say about muktakas in the first place. So I will conclude by simply summarizing some of the things that we can use as a potential framework that I have done while translating muktakas from the Sanskrit. The first is that they offer an advantage in terms of being somewhat freestanding already. We don't need too much context to understand the muktaka. We don't need to have characters that are well fleshed out. And this means to say that with a very minimal understanding of the conventions of poetry, it is possible to appreciate muktakas because they're meant to be plugged in anywhere and still be attractive and make sense. Secondly, there is always one key idea, which is sometimes a dhvani. But even if it is not a dhvani and if it's stated directly, either way, everything else is subordinate to the one key idea. In fact, so Anandavardhana and others compare dhvani to the beauty of a woman, and other things like rhetorical figures of speech are just her ornaments. So they supplement the real thing. They are not the real thing, which is great for a translator, because even if you skip the alliterations and the meter and the wordplay, you can either adapt those in some cases, or you can remove them altogether in curation when you're looking at muktakas. And when we come to dealing with ambiguity, so ambiguity can be retained at much smaller levels where different readers understand the poem differently. But vagueness is not generally a characteristic of Sanskrit muktakas at all. They must be very clear in what they are suggesting, even if it is a case of dhvani. So I think this gives a pretty good beginning point for a translator, which is what we have tried to do. But I'll pause here because I'd like to keep some more times for questions and discussion. I'll just stop sharing my screen now.
Is there any question people can ask?
Thank you, Anusha. It's a very difficult work to translate some of the Sanskrit poetries, and also the one that you translated, Tasya Damasyantikam, the way you meant it by that. There are many translations about that verse, but the way you could bring that implicature there, the Dhani there, that was very touching. Do you translate muktaka as freestanding?
I think it's a fairly workable translation.
I use
And
the
because
word for muktaka
particularly
standalone.
because just saying free or independent gives the sense that it's without metrical constraint, which I don't want to say. So I feel like freestanding is a better idea of what we mean by the muktaka.
I use standalone verse for muktaka.
Yeah, I think I'm sure that would work just as well.
And yeah, any other question? No? Your difficulties in translation. How you have dealt with it? At least new people. No?
I don't have a question per se, but observation. I think it's great that you at least introduce our students to the challenges.
Sorry,
Poetry.
I didn't quite catch what you said at the end.
I think it's wonderful that you could introduce our students to the challenges associated with translating Sanskrit. I don't particularly work with the poetry, kavya, and so forth, but even in the more straightforward language and shastras, it is not that obvious. Sometimes even the shastras are pretty either funny,
Absolutely, yes.
or they have
Yeah.
some kind of twist, or they're just beautifully written, and then it's not that easy to capture this in an English translation. I mean, I'm French speaking, I guess, but I never find English very pretty. So a pretty language as Sanskrit into a quite square language as English is quite a challenge if one wants to keep the aesthetic dimension of it. Not to mention the multiple meaning and puns and so forth, which you try to highlight it in your presentation. So it's not really a question, but rather a comment. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much. Very much appreciated.
Highlight it for our students. I mean, many of them are completely new to this, so I can understand they don't have necessarily a question. Something is coming. It's time to boil.
So, how important is understanding the historical and the philosophical background of Sanskrit, like, or the context of the poetry, is important in translating the work?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, actually. I would say there are multiple answers to that question. So one interesting thing about Sanskrit literature is that it's not always modeled on the real world, which is why when you see a poem where the speaker happens to be a village girl, I like to say that you can't imagine that the poet was a village girl. It's usually the case that the poet is a male poet writing at a royal court to impress other scholars in the court, and is simply drawing upon the conventions of Sanskrit love poetry rather than that the poet is really, say, a woman or even someone residing in a village. Even though the speaker will clearly be residing on the banks of the Godavari River, that's not the case. So in that sense, it's more important to know, I would say, the literary and intellectual context rather than the, say, social or economical context, especially because Sanskrit poetry tends to do this kind of replication where you have a poet who might live elsewhere, looking back centuries ago, being inspired by a particular text and modeling his own work after it. So that's one way to answer it. But there are also there is a lot of poetry that I read which is written by thinkers who are important to Vedanta traditions and so on. So if you're reading someone like Vedanta Deshika, who's a very important figure for the Vishishta Dvaita Vedanta tradition, then of course it would be impossible to completely understand what he's saying without having some philosophical background. But I think this is true for everything. And I think as speakers of Indian languages, we tend to make the mistake often of thinking that we have better access to the cultural milieu of texts, whether they're poetic or philosophical in Sanskrit, simply because of that, when sometimes they might actually be misleading us into thinking we understand something when we don't.
I just want to add one more question. Who are all the audience for the Sanskrit poetic work? So, for example, who are lot of interested in dialectical part, Prakarana Granthas, they will read that. Okay. So, who Kavi is doing Kavya for whom? It is if it is just for the general audience, they don't have that much knowledge to understand that. So only for few person, the scholars are very rare and few. So who are all the audience for this poetic and literature, Sanskrit literature?
Yeah, that's interesting, but I don't know if I can answer simply because the tradition is so huge. So we would need to localize which time we're talking about, which place we're talking about to see. For instance, the Kama Sutra claims that even women should educate themselves about the Kama Sutra because it pertains to them too. But at various points of time, there might be women or people who are not upper caste who are interested in or have access to the text itself. So if we look at a point of time and geographical space like the Vijayanagara Empire, then you would have various elite women who are also interested in reading poetry and are able to read and enjoy it, who are writing poetry, in fact. So I quoted a verse by Vijjika, who was supposed to be a Chalukyan queen, for example. But if we're talking about, so again, it would depend on how we would define general audiences. So how general is general? What was the general level of understanding of people? Did they even know Sanskrit? This would depend on the time we're talking about and the place we're talking about. And so some of the verses I quoted come from very different places and different times. So the Gaha Sattasai, for instance, the collection of Prakrit poetry is approximately 1st century, while something like Vijika is probably 8th or 9th century. And then we would have someone else like Ghanashyama writing in the 18th century. So we would have very different answers to the same question.
I have one question that's also like, because you have worked on the eligibility criteria paper. Keeping this particular question that just came up, now, for example, who is the target audience for certain poetries? Because you brought out this, that there is different space-time coordination when it comes to looking at the audience of the poetries, but do you really consider that other than the certain sections of the society, was these Sanskrit literature or Sanskrit poetries, they were inclusive because there is Prakrit and Sanskrit. So if there is the use of Prakrit, if everyone is the audience of the text, then why is there is the use of Prakrit? Was it to entertain the language or the cultural audience, or if there is if it is for everyone, then why there is just not Sanskrit? Why there is also Prakrit?
Absolutely. No, that's a fabulous question. And it's something that we've faced pushback against in the book, because it's called How to Love in Sanskrit when it also has other languages. So one common misconception that people have is that Sanskrit is the elite language while Prakrit is the language of the masses. When actually it turns out that Prakrit is as much of an elite literary language, sometimes even more so than Sanskrit is, because if you look at the Gaha Sattasai, for instance, that gets quoted by everyone for centuries, tens of centuries coming after, when Prakrit was no longer the spoken language, if it ever was. So at that point, while languages have already evolved to the upper Bhramsha stage, we still have people writing in Prakrit. In fact, Ghanashyama, the 18th century author I met, makes a big tries to make a very big point about writing in Prakrit and continuing to preserve the tradition of Prakrit. So Prakrit is as much of an elite language as Sanskrit. So the distinction between the two doesn't really apply that way. I would say that it's possible a lot of later kavya or natakas which have Prakrit dialogues for women and non-upper caste are simply so because of convention. I doubt it. I would seriously doubt that it is because some classes are actually still speaking Prakrit. So in that way, it becomes confusing to say that. And also, I don't think we can call any of this writing inclusive at all in any way, because the very idea of inclusion is, of course, a concept that we are all concerned with today and didn't exist in the minds of these writers. So one of the things I can say honestly is by reading, say, Vijjika as opposed to a male poet, I would not be able to distinguish a female voice from a male voice within the verse and determine which author wrote which. So I do think whether masculine or whether male or female, all authors are writing under similar conventions and constraints and are not really thinking about these issues in a way that we as contemporary readers are.
Can I ask?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Thank you for that. That was beautiful. This is actually practically my first introduction to Sanskrit poetry indeed, and it stirred so much interest in me. And I would like to ask, where can I start as the basics? And I can barely even read Sanskrit, so this would be yeah. Please do tell me.
Well, there are many courses available, but since you're right there at Manipal, I would say that I'm sure you have Intro to Sanskrit there, and I think that's a very good starting point. If you write to me, I'll be happy to recommend some books and other additional resources if you need them. But yeah, there's plenty of material out there to help someone learning Sanskrit, but I find it's always best done with a community of other learners, like all other languages. It's very difficult to pick up and even be motivated to memorize all those paradigms and declensions as someone just sitting by themselves in a room. It's much easier when you have a group of people to read interesting things like the Panchatantra or Ramayana with, I would say.
I meant more in terms of Sanskrit poetry on love. Is there a collection of poems that we can get our hands on?
Yes, I mean, I don't want to engage in self-promotion, but you can start with the book I mentioned at the start, How to Love in Sanskrit. But you can also look at some collections by DHH Ingalls. But none of those are just love poetry. So they have a bunch of whole other things, and you can get poetry in it. You can also look at translations of Sanskrit natakas themed on love. The Meghaduta would be a great starting point too. It's a messenger poem that starts off the whole tradition of messenger poetry. So yeah, there's a million things to do.
Sure.
Shringara Shataka also would be an ideal one.
Yeah, but I would say I would recommend Damaru Shataka better than the Shringara Shataka because I mean, if you're reading Bhartrahari, I would say the Vairagya Shataka is not to be missed. The Shringara, you can give it a miss and read Amaru.
I have one question that is pertinent to translation. When you said that the nature of the language complicates while the process of translation, but this would be a universally applicable statement to any language, even if other languages, like for example Kannada or Telugu or Malayalam or Tamil or any other Indian languages, North Indian or South Indian, from Sanskrit to translating to them also would be of the same difficulties, because not these languages are, even if they claim in their classical nature that there is use of compounds and all, but the amount of compound words that are used in Sanskrit language is not at all here. So they will have to break down, and also the use of certain phrases, certain tropes may not be natural or internal to these other languages. So, it would go again within European languages, from German to French or German to Spanish, or even French to Spanish, even if they fall in the same language family category. Translating from one language to another language would always have their own difficulties. Now, so what would be not exactly, I mean, you address this point in your lecture, what you have done in your work, keeping these challenges in mind. But generally speaking, what do you feel about this, and what would be an ideal process, for example, philosophical translations or literary translations? What should a translator keep in mind? Should be the reader, or should be the language? The source language or the target language?
Oh, yeah. No, that's the eternal translator's dilemma that you're giving the question to. So I don't think I can answer that. But I would say it's very dependent on what the purpose of the translation is. For instance, translating the same poem. So I translated several poems over the course of my presentation, and some of them are meant to give an idea of what the word play in the original is. So there I still have to adopt a more plain kind of approach where I'm simply highlighting the puns in some way that I find best fits the occasion. At other times, if I want to convey the punch of the verse, I have to take a less literalist approach and work on what the effect of the original is. So I would say this depends in major part on, one, who the audience you're imagining is. Is it someone who's just getting introduced to Sanskrit, or are you writing for scholars? Secondly, the genre, of course, that you said, that's the most important thing. Is it a philosophical text? Because if I'm trying to read Vyasatirtha's Nyayamrita, then I really don't want to hear all about the kinds of wordplay that he has got going on. What I really want to do is to make sense of a very complicated text. So with regard to philosophical texts, I found that the approach that I appreciate best as a student trying to make sense of these texts is one that acts as a kind of commentary. So certain translations of Kumarila by John Tabor, for instance, they'll give you a passage, they'll translate it, and then they'll act as an English commentary on the text and tell you what the argument is helping with, or what the unstated assumption or the unstated question there is. And I find that helps. So basically, I think that working organically from what the Sanskrit does is most helpful, because that's what a Sanskrit commentary does as well. And if we look at commentators of the very rich commentarial tradition we have, both for philosophy and for literature, it will help us to make sense of what kind of audience we have, and what approach to use, what would work best.
This answer will be very helpful for the students, because they will have to they'll deal with literature very less, and philosophy more. So the literature is just a crash course in the very first semester, just to get an idea of where all philosophy can be applied. So whereas they will be dealing with philosophical works, translations of philosophical works, so it will be very ideal for them to understand what, as a student, that they should look for from the translation, and how to make sense of the translation was very well presented by you. That was helpful.
Well, thank you so much. But I would love to hear what you think as well on the best approach to a philosophical translation, because I've never met two people who think quite the same thing. And as someone who engages with a lot of philosophical texts yourself, what
Personally speaking, I'm a Puritan, so I try to bring the as best as possible the originality in the target language. So because it should not stray away from the it should not bring a lot of translator's intention into the original work, rather than bring the the writer's contribution in the target language, but at the same time, works are always for the audience. So it should not again stray away from the audience. So it should not make the audience feel that it is imposing upon them something. So I feel that that balance of bringing the writer's intent and reaching out to the target audience, that sort of bridge, which is a very difficult modus operandi in translation, but at the same time, that's the one way that I seek to keep in my mind always. So, because
I
there
think
are
it's
certain
very
models like
interesting.
Hollandaise, which is very helpful in this operation.
Yes, yes. I agree, which is why the approach that I said I liked involves like strictly demarcating between like your commentary on what you think the text is doing and a pure, as you said, translation of the text itself. So a reader can decide where they disagree with the translator and where they disagree with the author, and the two should be sharply demarcated. But I feel like some kind of commentary on philosophical text would be very helpful, because when I read philosophers translating Sanskrit philosophy, as someone who is a historian of religion rather than a philosopher, I find it very difficult to follow sometimes. So I think a commentary in English would be very helpful. That's what we should be doing.
That's often, I guess, because the philosophers use technical vocabulary that they inherited from Latin, and especially let's say in the Nyaya field, let's say from the 60s, 70s, 80s, they use very difficult terms that are far away. Often, like one word in Sanskrit become 3 words, 4 words in English that are not even used in English itself. Right? They are borrowed from Latin, anglicized. They became a technical term within the Sanskrit, and it's even worse in French actually. If you,
I see.
so I tend to read more because there's more literature in English. But if I read, let's say, French scholars working on Buddhism, sometimes I don't know what they're talking about, even if it's in my language, because they take all these philosophical terms straight from Latin or Greek, and they coin like neologism out of these Greek terms to somehow capture an aspect or another of the Sanskrit. I give you an example like quiddity. Who used quiddity?
I was thinking of the same term.
Nobody used quiddity. You will never hear this in a pub, I swear. You look very smart if you ever do it. Or you have the one which I like was in the French started doing this for nirvana or samadhi. They started calling it samadhi anstesis. Instead of ecstasis, they went to anstesis. The opposite of X. So anyway, all these terms make it makes the reading extremely difficult. So actually, it feels like you have to relearn your French when you're reading French translation of Sanskrit. It's very trouble. Whereas in English, they because there's more publication, there tends to be kind of a cohesion. People start to agree on some technical terms, so they repeat and you get to know them. For me, since I read less French, I switch and I'm often completely lost. And the French are a bit pedantic, right? So they like these beautiful flowery language. So it makes the philosophical translation really impossible. You have to be French plus a Sanskritist, and you have to be kind of a scholar of that. Yeah.
No, actually, when I was saying that I have Puritan approach, exactly what I was thinking was prakara prakari bhava. So then I was thinking prakara will be bhasamana vishishta pratyogitvam. So the quiddity would be the ideal word for it. So if you try to say qualification, that would not communicate what actually it means. So in that sense, we will have to go back to Greek and Latin to understand or try to bring them, recoin them, and then reuse them, so that we would be able to actually, even if it is very alien and even if it is very exotic or sometimes it strays away from, but at the same time it also brings certain pregnant ideas that we may not be able to see it out. So then it in that sense it's a better. So yes, of course I tend to go to a lot mirror translation, but because commentarial translations, what happens is that unless it's demarcated, as you pointed out, it's not the original author's work, it's actually your commentary. So unless it comes as a special notes, because many of the Kannada translations actually have taken a lot of liberty, in particularly in philosophy and literature work, as if they have imposed their translation as the original author's intent. Sometimes it is also there are a lot of hidden agenda, like to impress the audience and make the audience comfortable and so on, but at the same time it is not what the original work is all about. So this I've seen. In this sense, I appreciate couple of some Tamil translations. For example, there are some works. Heidegger has been translated into Tamil. Camus has been translated into Tamil, where they have tried using a lot of Tamil words that the Tamil readers themselves cannot understand, but at the same time they have tried to make it internalized so that that ecosystem is built.
Also, it's not just a technical vocabulary that is difficult, I find, for the philosophical translation, though it's more rare, but there are philosophers who are funny, and they build within their verses attacks or in a humoristic style that, if you just translate plain meaning, you can still grasp that there's something going on, but it's not as funny as if you have the Sanskrit itself. I'm thinking here of an author I really like from Viveka from the 6th century. It's a Buddhist Madhyamika. And so I worked on a chapter he did on the Mimamsakas. And he particularly despised the Mimamsakas because of their involvement in ritual. So they are karma margins in some way. And he finds all kind of funny way to ridicule them in relation to either their belief or their rituals. And sometimes, it's so explicit what he's saying that you will feel ashamed to translate it, right? And in the same thing, he has a license that today we would be, we're so politically correct, right? And especially today, right? We really have to be careful in what you say. And you translate these words, and he goes attacking. There is one, I will not even translate it, but he goes and he attacks the fact that one wife has 2 husbands, or even 5, and he goes about that person who has these 2 husbands, and he goes, she sleeps with one in the morning, the other at night. What kind of a person is she? And he goes on a couple of verses on this, and it's very delicious in terms of humor in a philosophical text. But yeah, how to go about translating it is not that easy. And it's not about the technicality, it's about the double meaning sometimes, or the
Absolutely.
humor.
I think what compounds that complication is if the text you're translating is actually part of a living tradition that people still revere and believe in, which is true for me because I work on Vedanta. So that makes things all the more tricky because they're not taken in the spirit or the tone in which they were originally written if you present them the same way now. So
there's actually very few, or not that I know, but I don't know much scholars who worked on humor in Sanskrit philosophy. I was looking for, but I haven't found much paper or reflection on. It's always somehow assume that it's dry. Systematic is the word you always hear, but funny and witty is less used and less explored.
Is there any questions from online participants? Which one was? Okay.
Arjuna has written a comment.
Thank you,
thank
Dr.
you so
Anusha.
much.
Listening to
It's
your
nice to
thoughtful
hear from you virtually.
Okay.
this lecture will be helpful for, because when I went through your book, I had a couple of questions, but this lecture actually answered those questions. One of our students, when they made a paper for a Dubai conference on Kama Sutra, they actually read your book and then they cited the book in the presentation. So at that point of time also I had certain questions of why there is a huge wave of different approaches in certain translations, I felt, but actually this lecture was answering that. So what all you have tried to what you have tried to attempt in your work. We haven't done that in our
That's very
library, so I
basic.
think our students will make use of it.
Yeah. Do feel free to pass on my email to anyone who wants to write to
Yeah.
me about
PDF.
it. All right.
Shall
Thank
we
you so much for having me here.
Just a minute. The session we just had was very informative and introduced beginners to new concepts and fields. Even the topic was advanced. The speaker did an excellent job of explaining it in the way that was easy to understand. I want to express my gratitude to the speaker for accepting our invitation and addressing our students and our students and staff of Manipal. On behalf of DOP Mahe, I also want to thank all students for listening attentively and the team of organizing. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
So,